Welcome to this deep dive explainer. Today, we're unpacking a massive initiative, the European Commission's Invest AI program. The headline, a staggering 200 billion euros to keep Europe in the global AI race. It's being touted as Europe's grand answer to the flood of billions pouring out of Silicon Valley. But how much substance is actually behind that massive number? We're going to do a reality check today and see what the data actually tells us.
Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at that 200 billion euro headline. Then, we'll see how that math actually shrinks. After that, we'll tackle the time problem, make a hard data comparison with the US, and finally, look at why a funding pot isn't necessarily a strategy. Let's dive right in.
Part 1. The 200 billion euro headline.
Just look at that number, 200 billion euros. I mean, with that kind of capital, you could literally build entire industries from the ground up. And that is the exact figure being used to present the Invest AI program. But as always, the devil is in the bureaucratic details, or more accurately, in one very specific word used in the official communication.
And here's the catch. The Commission isn't actually saying they're spending 200 billion euros. They're saying they want to mobilize this sum. So, what does that actually mean in Brussels speak? Well, it means taking a comparatively small amount of public money and essentially just hoping that private investors will chip in a massive multiple of that from their own pockets. That single word, mobilize, changes the entire story completely.
Which brings us to part 2, how the math shrinks.
The EU's stated goal here is a leverage ratio of 1 to 10. So for every public euro, they want to pull in 10 private euros. When we break down that 200 billion, here's what we find. Only 50 billion is actual real public money. The remaining 150 billion, that's a whopping 75% of the headline number, is just hoped-for private capital. It's money that isn't there yet and hasn't actually been committed. And you know what the real paradox is here? This specific type of private venture capital, this deep growth capital, is exactly what Europe fundamentally lacks right now. So they're essentially building a funding structure on something that doesn't currently exist at that scale.
Let's take this math a step further down the funnel. Out of that 50 billion euros in actual public money, only 20 billion is specifically reserved for what they call AI Gigafactories. These are those massive, purpose-built artificial intelligence training facilities designed to give researchers and startups the sheer compute power they desperately need.
But hold on, because it goes even deeper, and this perfectly illustrates just how incredibly complex these funding pots really are. Brussels isn't even paying for that full 20 billion in compute power alone. Under this funding model, the EU Commission covers a maximum of 17% of the investment costs for one of these facilities. The remaining 83%? Well, that has to be scraped together by the individual member states and private backers again. So if we follow this funnel all the way to the very bottom, here's where we land. That giant 200 billion euro headline officially shrinks down to a direct, guaranteed commitment from the EU Commission in the single-digit billions for actual compute power. It's huge in the headlines, but dramatically scaled down when you look at the guaranteed real-world impact.
Part 3, the time problem.
Let's walk through the Commission's timeline for a second. In early June 2026, we get the basic approval from the Euro HPC Governing Board. The formal tender process for the Gigafactories doesn't even start until July 2026, and these facilities, they aren't expected to be fully operational until 2027 or 2028. Now, we're talking about a technology race where Silicon Valley measures progress in quarters. So by mid-2026, Europe will basically be presenting tender documents and financial structures while the actual silicon won't be laid down for years.
Now, to be completely fair and objective about the data here, things are happening. Currently, there's one single site for a gigafactory under construction in Norway, which is going to be powered by hydro. And alongside that, there are 19 much smaller AI factories in the works, which are essentially just upgrades to existing supercomputers. It is definitely a start, for sure, but the sheer scale of it remains pretty modest when you put it in a global context.
Part 4, the bitter US comparison.
Just the 4 major US hyperscalers, Amazon, Microsoft, Alphabet, and Meta, are projected to spend around $700 billion in capital expenditures in 2026 alone. Let's just single out Amazon for a second. They're planning to spend roughly $200 billion in 2026. Put simply, one single US company is investing roughly 10 times the amount of Europe's entire multi-year gigafactory pot in just 1 year. The difference in scale is literally astronomical.
And it gets even more stark when you look at individual projects. On one side, you have Europe locked in long negotiations over a 17% subsidy rate for a shared funding pot. Meanwhile, Microsoft is just dropping a $10 billion data center in Portugal alone. Think about that. That's half of Europe's entire flagship compute budget being invested by a single US tech giant right on European soil.
Part 5. A pot, not a strategy.
The data from regulatory agencies clearly highlights the actual structural roadblocks here. Electricity prices for industry in Europe are roughly twice as high as in the US. Grid connections and permitting processes can drag on for years. We're looking at heavily fragmented capital markets that completely lack deep, late-stage funding. Top talent is flying out the door to wherever the money and the compute power are. And the result? According to the Commission itself, about 264 billion euros drain out to US cloud providers every single year. These are the actual root causes of Europe's lag. And not a single item on this list is directly fixed by the Invest AI program.
Interestingly enough, Commission President Ursula von der Leyen actually highlighted this exact flaw, maybe inadvertently. She stated that taxpayers simply can't bear this cost alone and that private capital is urgently needed. But as our source material rightly points out, nobody says that about money they already have. It just confirms this absolute reliance on the exact private capital that is structurally missing in Europe.
Now, presenting this completely neutrally, there is a very fair counterargument to be made here. Public seed capital is a standard model worldwide. The US uses these kinds of levers too. And yes, getting some gigafactories built is absolutely better than doing nothing at all. That's entirely true. But the reality still stands, a 1 to 10 leverage is just a goal, it's not a fact. More importantly, throwing together a funding pot might get a few facilities built, but it does absolutely nothing to speed up grid connections, it doesn't fix fragmented capital markets, and it definitely won't stop the brain drain of top AI researchers.
The source material sums up this entire analysis with one razor-sharp sentence. The EU is confusing a funding pot with a strategy. Essentially, throwing a relatively small, delayed check at an exponentially growing structural problem is a category error. Money can be a tool within a strategy, for sure, but it is never the strategy itself.
And that brings us to our final thought for today's explainer. Can a funding pot ever truly buy competitiveness if the structural foundation, everything from energy prices to bureaucracy and capital markets, remains fundamentally broken? It is the central question hovering over Europe's technological future, something to really think about. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.